All right, here we are back with Salovey, Mayer, and Caruso's model, and we are going to start with the emotional perception and expression component. Let's start with recognizing facial expressions. We'll take a little test. What emotion is she displaying? Hopefully you said anger. How about him? Hopefully you said fear. How about her? Disgust. She smelled something bad or saw something gross. How about her? Okay. She looks a little fearful, but we already have fear up there. So pick something else. Surprise. Notice the difference between fear and surprise. Surprise, the eyebrows are up, whereas fear, the eyebrows are pulled together in the middle. Notice that in the fearful mouth, the corners of the mouth are pulled straight back, whereas the surprised mouth has dropped open. So those are the two big differences. How about this guy? Oh, I'll bet you can get that one. He's happy. And you can tell he's actually happy, not just putting on a smile, because he's got these little wrinkles in the corners of his eyes. His smile is what's called a Duchenne smile, which is a smile that is being displayed in response to an actual emotion. The smiles that we put on our faces for pictures and things like that are usually easily detectable as not sincere because they are lacking these wrinkles and the degree of wrinkles on the side of the mouth and those kinds of things. How about this one? Hopefully you detected that as sad. So these are the basic emotions. These are typically the pure emotions that are seen in every single culture all around the world. These same exact facial expressions would be displayed all around the world when a person is experiencing these emotions. There are mixed emotions that are more culturally specific, shame or pride, things like that. Those kinds of things tend to emerge a little bit later after, a child is a year and a half, 2 years old. They might start developing these mixed emotions, whereas pretty early in their lives, they start displaying these pure emotions. That kind of gives the impression that these emotions are very biologically based and that the mixed emotions are like confusion or other things like that are maybe things that we develop through experience with the world. So I thought it would be fun to put into our playlist a couple of videos for you to watch. We've got adolescent emotion recognition, and this is a really fun one to look at because it shows sort of how our ability to recognize faces doesn't fully mature till we're a little bit older. Whoops, sorry.
Now they have to touch
Stop. Then this one is Paul Ekman, who's very famous for the concept of micro expressions. And he really feels like micro expressions give us a lot of insight into the actual emotional state of the person that we are, having a conversation with or watching on TV. Micro expressions give us much more information about their true feelings. So that video will go into that. And then this final one is, YouTube video on how to detect deception. And you'll notice that they give you some hard, fast rules about what to look for. And I would just like to argue, be careful about that. Hard, fast rules generally don't work. But go ahead and watch those videos when you get done with this one. I think you'll find them very interesting. So we did a little exercise there and tried to recognize emotions in somebody else's face. How about the process of recognizing our own emotions? When we recognize our own emotions, we more than likely are going to be relying on internal states. We're not probably going to stand in front of the mirror and try and guess what emotion we're probably feeling. Instead, we're probably going to assess how we're feeling on the inside. But there's there are some factors that go into our assessment of our emotion that include things like what was happening right before I started to feel like this. One of the things that's important to know about emotions is that they all have very similar patterns of physiological arousal. Laughing really hard and crying really hard produce heart rate increases and blood pressure increases and other kinds of things that if we just were to measure your body, we wouldn't be able to tell what emotion you were experiencing. If we looked at your face, you might be crying in both situations. If you're laughing really hard, you might laugh till you cry. So we might not be even able to tell by your facial expressions. But the way that an observer could tell whether you're laughing or crying in sadness or mirth, or how you assess whether you're laughing or crying out of sadness or mirth, is that you assess what was happening right before. And so, if something funny happened right before, I'm going to guess you're probably laughing. I guess, there are some people who have, inappropriate emotions. So hopefully that doesn't describe you. And, you laugh when something's funny and you cry when something's sad, right? Sometimes you laugh till you cry. And sometimes you cry out of sheer happiness. I mean, these things can happen, but generally we take into consideration what happened, and that helps us to decide how to label that emotion. Another aspect about emotional perception and expression is to figure out how to express our emotions productively. Have you ever been so nervous about needing to maybe assert yourself? Maybe you need to go talk to your boss about needing a day off, or you need to go talk to your professor about points that were taken off of your assignment that you don't think are fair. Maybe you feel like they didn't read it closely enough to recognize that you did cover what was required or whatever. And so you need to go have the conversation, but you're really worried that you may not express your emotions productively, that you may be so nervous, maybe angry, that you might actually express tears. Has anybody else besides me ever cried when they were just really actually super nervous and or maybe a little angry? So sometimes we have inappropriate emotional expressions that we don't want to have. Like we don't want to go in to talk to our professor about a grade and end up crying like that. Who wants to do that? Or get really angry. Who wants to do that? Right? You don't want to, but sometimes we don't express our emotions in the most productive way. So one of the things about emotional maturity or emotional intelligence is learning to regulate those emotions so that you don't have inappropriate emotions when you don't want to. It doesn't work perfectly for anyone. I have very high functioning colleagues who have had emotional breakdowns at meetings that they are embarrassed about later. A lot of us don't say, and I say us because I'm included in this group, don't say a lot of things at meetings for fear that we will have an inappropriate emotion, right? So I think it's something that we get better at with age and experience and maturity, but it's not something that's perfect. I've had students in classes get on like a very weak nerve, and I have not in this context been able to react in the most productive way. I haven't ever had like a big outburst, but I've had times where I'm like, I'm not talking to you anymore. I have to walk away. I don't know if that's completely productive. I think there's an expectation. I'm supposed to be more professional than that, but sometimes we, all of us have times where it's just not going to work. So it's a goal. It's not something that we are expecting of ourselves to be perfect. You should not expect of yourself to be always perfect in expressing your emotions in a productive way. Sometimes we backslide. Which brings us to the issue of trying not to be in denial. Try not to act as if you're not having emotions that you're having. If you're having an emotion, maybe naming it will give it less power, right? If you say, you know what, I came in here to have a neutral conversation, but I'm actually finding myself feeling kind of angry. I'm feeling kind of nervous. Saying those out loud in a sort of neutral way sometimes can dispel it, right? Make it have less power over us. If we don't deny the emotion, then we take away its power to sort of hijack us, to put us in a position that we don't want to be. So that's a little tip about, how to manage and regulate emotions. Maybe acknowledge the emotions that you're having. That's a tough one. A lot of us don't like to acknowledge all the emotions we're having. How about emotional facilitation of thought? The next phase of Salovoy et al.'s model. So emotions can benefit thinking. There's, for example, something that we call the sadder but wiser effect. Some people call it depressive realism. What we mean by that term is clinically depressed people tend to be better at recognizing their lack of influence in random events. Here's a study from 1979 that illustrates the concept. So the participants were placed in front of a screen and they were told to push a button and that they could then control the movement of the dots on the screen. And the truth was they were not controlling the dots on the screen at all. It was all random. But if you've ever interacted with random things, sometimes it feels like you made it happen, right? Sometimes if you're pushing a button, you might do it at exactly the right moment that it seems like you made the outcome occur. Clinically depressed people gave up on this task much more quickly than non-depressed people who, in complete vain, there was no hope, they were not controlling anything, stuck with it a lot longer in the belief that they just had to figure out the system. They just had to figure out what they did that last time to make it happen, to make it happen again. They really thought they had control when in fact they did not have control. So in some ways, the clinically depressed person is more realistic. Non-depressed people tended to, Alloy went through a whole bunch of studies with different colleagues. So across their research, non-depressed people tended to overestimate their control over positive outcomes in particular. They honestly thought that when they were successful, that was them. They made it happen. And when it didn't go the way that they wanted, well, that was random chance. They tended to underestimate their control over negative outcomes to the point where they were like, it's just that the negative stuff's just randomly happening. I'm controlling these positive things. In fact, there's a quote there on the right-hand side, positive results never come from negative thoughts, right? The idea that you can control good outcomes, that if you just try hard enough, that's the kind of thing that non-depressed people think. People who are depressed are much more likely to say, I'm not having control over either of these things. I'm not doing this anymore. Clinically depressed people rated their own social skills in alignment with objective observers' ratings of their social skills. So they're more realistic about themselves, according to this study by Louisjean and colleagues. So clinically depressed people are actually more accurate in recognizing their own behaviors and their own shortcomings. Non-depressed people tend to display what we call the self-serving bias, where they see themselves through sort of rose-colored glasses, and they think they're doing a better job than they are, that they're more skilled than they are, that they're more funny than they are, all sorts of things that aren't true. I think personally that the self-serving bias helps to prevent depression, because if we were to accurately look at ourselves and recognize all the times that we are not living up to our expectations, we may feel bad. We may move into more depressive-like thoughts and behaviors. So clinically depressed people are more accurate in their self-assessments than non-depressed people are. Another factor in emotional facilitation of thought is the role of stress as an emotion, right? Stress does bring some benefits to it. A lot of times we talk about our lives having too much stress, but I think we're talking about, overwhelming stress or only negative stress. And so it's important to remember there are different kinds of stress. Now, this first example, flashbulb memory, it can occur in the face of negative stressors, positive stressors, anytime that you get sort of an adrenaline burst. So maybe you got really bad news or you got really good news and it gave you like an adrenaline boost. It causes us to focus our attention really on everything that's going on right now when we got that news. And so it may be we remember what the weather was like. We remember who gave us the news. We remember what format they gave us the news. Was it on the phone? Was it face-to-face? Was it on the news? Who was with us when we found out? What were we thinking? What were we wearing? What time of day was it? What was the weather like? I already mentioned that part. Let's see. Lots of just random stuff. It causes us to sort of, it's like a flash bulb went off and everything that got illuminated gets immediately stored and kept in memory. One hypothesis for why this happens is that it's been beneficial to our species over time to have this ability to notice all of these incidental details about stressful events. I always like to give this example. Imagine you're a cave person and it's your job today to go down to the water hole and get a skin bag full of water and bring it back to the cave. But you kind of delayed a little bit because you were busy, napping new arrowheads or whatever you were doing. And so you finally get it together, get your bag, and you start to go down the water hole. And it's a little later in the day than usual. And so the shadows are a little longer and you're not really hearing any birds chirping. And you think, well, maybe it's because it's, a little bit later than I usually go. And then when you get down to the water and you're collecting water in your bag, you see that there's a cougar and it's ready to pounce. But thanks to you noticing it, you got away from it. You get back to the cave. And you reflect on what happened. And you remember, I didn't hear any birds chirping. The shadows were a lot longer than usual. It was, sort of a humid day. All these details. Think how beneficial it would be if the next time you're getting ready to go down to the watering hole, you say to yourself, the shadows look kind of long. It's kind of humid. I don't hear any birds. Maybe I'll get water tomorrow. Maybe there's going to be a cougar at the watering hole. Those kinds of details may have saved your life, right? And so some people think that flashbulb memories are just sort of an extrapolation of that under that kind of stress, you sort of store everything so that maybe you won't get yourself into that situation again is maybe the ultimate purpose. Stress gives us extra energy and endurance, so maybe that's why you were able to get away from the cougar who tried to pounce, right? Because when you're under stress, you actually can run faster and longer and, that kind of thing. And so with extra energy and endurance, we're more able to live through the event. When we master stressful situations, it helps to facilitate personal growth. It helps to boost our self-esteem. If you got away from a pouncing cougar, I have a feeling the other cave people are pretty impressed with you. And you take a step up in everybody else's esteem as well as your own. You develop more self-efficacy. You're like, I got away from a cougar one time. I'm pretty sure I could do it again, right? And it makes you more resilient. You are less likely to just maybe cower in the cave. You might be like, I can do it again if it were to happen again. So mastering stressful situations makes it more likely that we will maybe try something stressful in the future, maybe push ourselves a little bit in the future. Hopefully not going down to the watering hole in exactly the same circumstance that we managed to get away from one time, but it helps to make sure that we keep trying. And that's an important factor in, positive psychology, right? The resilience and the growth. These are really important things in this field. All right, let's consider whether this is a challenge or this is a threat. Anna is running for a seat in her state legislature. She's a political rookie. This is her first foray into the political arena. However, her uncle ran for the office of mayor in her hometown 10 years ago and won, and she gained a lot of experience helping him on that campaign. Anna is committed to her political party's platform, is consistently rated highly in local polls conducted by local media groups, has raised a comfortable amount of money to fund her campaign, and is confident in the position she has taken on all of the local issues. Now it is time for her public debate with her opponent. Backstage, while waiting for the signal to take her place at the podium, Anna notices that her heart is racing and she feels butterflies in her stomach. She thought she was ready for the debate, but now she isn't so sure. How would you label what she's experiencing? Is she nervous and experiencing performance anxiety? Or is she just energized and raring to go against her opponent? How would you label what Anna is going through? If you try putting yourself in Anna's position, maybe. Empathize with Anna's circumstances. And think about it. If you were experiencing this, would you label it performance anxiety or would you label it excitement, you're energized and raring to go. The way that you choose to label this will help to determine whether it's a stressful event that is so stressful that you're distracted and you may not be able to perform at your highest level, or if the stress of the situation actually just energizes you and makes you perform even better. The way that you assess an event as either a challenge or a threat will help to determine how you cope with that situation. If you label it a challenge, you're going to find yourself doing much better in the face of that challenge than if you label it a threat, which now I have to feel nervous about. I have to put some of my cognitive energy into sort of defraying this threat. So if you naturally leaned one way or another, that might be your explanatory style. And that's a factor that can help to contribute to you striving for more things or being resilient, or it's certainly a manifestation of your self-efficacy. If you feel like it's a threat, you're kind of to a certain extent labeling it something that you don't feel like you're really up for. Whereas if you label it a challenge, it implies more self-efficacy, a belief that you can. All right, let's break here and we will come back and talk about whether it's a challenge or a threat and what role personality plays.